Welcome to the Global Medical Device Podcast, where today's brightest minds in the medical device industry go to get their most useful and actionable insider knowledge direct from some of the world's leading medical device experts and companies.
All right, you've probably heard Mike Drues and I mention regulatory strategy a time or two on previous episodes of the Global Medical Device Podcast. And we thought it might be helpful if we went into a little bit more depth and detail about what is a regulatory strategy and give you some tips and pointers on how to construct one. So enjoy this episode of the Global Medical Device Podcast. Hello, and welcome to another exciting episode of the Global Medical Device Podcast. This is your host, founder, and VP of Quality and Regulatory at Greenlight Guru, John Speer. And I thought we would take, I guess, a little bit deeper dive into a topic that it's been something we've discussed at least superficially in previous episodes of the Global Medical Device Podcast. And that topic is regulatory strategy. And what I hope today is that we peel back some of the layers and give you a little bit more practical, pragmatic tips and pointers on what it is and maybe the components that make up a regulatory strategy. And of course, who better than to dive into topics regulatory related in med device other than Mike Drues with Vascular Sciences. So Mike, welcome.
Thank you, John. Always a pleasure to speak with you and your audience.
You and I, like I said, we've talked both on the Global Medical Device Podcast and during our own conversations about regulatory strategy. And, you know, as you and I typically do on these things, that might be a kind of a good framework to start, just what is a regulatory strategy, from a 30,000 foot view. And then through the course of the next few minutes or so that you and I are chatting, we can start to dive a little bit deeper. So maybe a minute or so, give people an overview or kind of a big picture idea of a regulatory strategy.
Well, I think that's a great place to start, John. And as always, I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this very important topic with you today. Let me turn the tables around just a little bit. I don't know about in your experience, John, but in my world, a lot of people will equate regulatory strategy with pathway to market. In other words, many times I'll ask somebody when I come, talk to a new company for the first time, I'll ask them, what is their regulatory strategy? And they will respond by saying 510K or de novo or something like that. Do you think that kind of a response is a regulatory strategy? In other words, do you think that regulatory strategy is synonymous with pathway to market?
I think pathway to market is an element, but, as far as 510K de novo, that's a tactic, and this topic of strategy I've found over my career is often a word that's misunderstood and maybe misapplied or misused in some cases. And I actually did a lot of studying on my own to try to better understand strategy a few years ago. And I came across this definition for strategy, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit. The author, I'll give her credit. Her name's Erica Anderson. She has quite a few books, by the way, but she had this definition that I really liked. And strategy is a hope for future. To me, that's simplified strategy. But I think something like a 510K or de novo is more of a tactical execution of a strategy, not the strategy.
Well, I would agree with you, John, and I find that interesting definition of strategy, a hope for a future, kind of an interesting definition. But I agree with you that regulatory strategy is not synonymous with pathway to market. Pathway to market, whether it's 510K or PMA or whatever, is the end game, is where you want to end up as a result of your regulatory strategy. Your regulatory strategy is the consideration of all of the different options and the pathway to get there. So to use a metaphor that I've used many times in the past, John, this is a poker game. And just like in poker, strategy is key. So your strategy is not necessarily to win the game. That's the outcome. But the strategy is how you get there, considering all of your different options, which card do you play and when, and so on and so on. That is, to me, what strategy is all about. And it sounds like, from what you just said, John, that's what it is to you as well. But regrettably, It doesn't seem that to be that way for everybody that we talk to.
Yeah, I think, it's a good place to start because, and I appreciate the example because I do think a lot of people think, about regulatory strategy as a 510K. It's like, well, wait a minute. And, you and I have chatted about this and exchanged some notes on this. I think it's for a strategy to be meaningful. You have to consider all the different options, the pros, the cons, the good, the bad, the ugly, and that sort of thing. Thoughts about that?
Yeah, again, John, you and I are singing exactly the same song here. You do have to consider all of the different options and the advantages and disadvantages. And one of the many things that I've learned in my almost 30 years of playing this game is that unlike what some people might think, there's nothing in the world, the regulatory world anyway, that's black and white. True or false, right or wrong. There's an infinite number of shades of gray. So, for example, one of the things that differentiates my approach to regulatory and quality as well, for that matter, compared to so many others, is that I will never tell a company what not to do. In other words, I refuse to play the regulatory police, as is the case in many different organizations. Instead, on the contrary, I pride myself on giving the company all of their different options and the advantages and disadvantages of each. And then together we have a discussion of what option is best for that particular company, given their business goals, given their resources, given their risk tolerance, and so on and so on. And I guarantee, John, I just said this to one of my new customers yesterday, that one company in a certain set of circumstances might decide to go down one particular pathway, whereas another company, given exactly the same circumstances, might decide to go down a completely different pathway. So this is all what goes into the strategy, at least the way I think of it in that sense of the word.
Yeah, for sure. And so I guess I'll highlight or reemphasize pro tip. The first pro tip that we've talked about so far today is, folks, if your regulatory quote strategy says 510K or de novo or class 1 exempt, that is not a strategy. That is not a strategy. So, all right. So let's sort of dive into sort of the makeup or the construct of what goes into a regulatory strategy, and maybe a good thing or a good place to start with this, because I envision this is a living artifact in some way, shape, or form, call it a document or record or what have you. But I think the key thing about this artifact is it's a communication tool certainly within my company, within the stakeholders. It articulates and expands upon the pros, the cons, the options, the business risk, and those sorts of things. But with every good artifact, there's usually a nice summary section. And what would you put into, or what is a regulatory strategy executive summary? What would be contained within that?
So great question, John. So one of the first things that I often do in many of my projects when a company asks me to come in and help them is we will put together what I call a regulatory strategy executive summary. It's not a full-blown regulatory strategy. It's just a summary of our different options, our different, for example, pathways to market. You mentioned a few: class 1 exempt, 510K, de novo, maybe wellness exemption, maybe PMA, maybe HDE. Obviously, it's going to be a contingent on the labeling and the technology, but we will put together a list of all of the different options and the advantages and disadvantages of each. And to the extent that I can also provide a regulatory burden assessment and a regulatory risk assessment of each of those options. So, for example, if the company decides to go option 1, here's the kind of testing that you would need. Here's the kind of data that you would need. Here's the relative probability of successfully getting it through the FDA or not. On the other hand, if you go to option number 2, this is the kind of testing, this is the kind of data that we would need, and this would be the regulatory risk or the probability of successfully taking it through the FDA or not. So again, it's a summary of all of our different options, and then we can add more and more components on top of that. Does that make sense, John?
Yeah, it totally does. And I have a picture in my mind of some of the use cases where this executive summary would be helpful. But what are some of the areas where a regulatory strategy executive summary can be used?
So it can be used in many different ways. For example, it can be used in a variety of business planning purposes when the company is trying to get an estimate of time and money to get a particular device onto the market. But to be honest with you, John, my favorite way to use the regulatory strategy executive summary is with small companies and startups who are in the process of raising money, or with medium or large-sized companies where somebody needs to get the buy-in of the senior management team in order to approve or greenlight the progression of that project. So What a lot of companies do, for example, let's take the small and the startups as an example. They'll take this regulatory strategy executive summary and they'll boil it down to 2 or 3 PowerPoint slides that then they put into their investor pitch deck. And as some of your audience may know, John, I also consult for a variety of angel and VC groups. So I see, the investment piece from both sides. When it comes to pitching your idea for a medical device to a potential investor or to a potential to senior management of your existing company, there's really 2 things that you and your team need to demonstrate. First is that you and your team know all of your different options. 510K, de novo, yada, yada, yada. To be honest with you, John, that's the easy part. The much harder part to demonstrate to the potential investor or to your senior management is that you and your team have the knowledge and experience to roll with the punches. In other words, as you and I have talked about many times over the months and years, John, regulatory is a very fluid, very dynamic kind of environment. Things are changing. And I'll give you a quick example. There are many devices that are on the market here in the United States that have come onto the market in the past under the 510K, say 10 years ago or even 5 years ago. But if that same device came to the FDA today with exactly the same submission, it might not get through. The question is why? What has changed? Has the regulation for the 510K changed? Absolutely not. The regulation has not changed, in fact, at all since the 510K was created in 1976. Yes, there's been guidance that have come out and so on, but not the regulation itself. But what has changed is the level of, let's call it scrutiny, if you will, that FDA is applying to certain parts of those 510K submissions. I think it's a little beyond the scope of this particular discussion, John, to get into those details. But bottom line, we have to demonstrate to our potential investors or to our senior management that we know what our options are and that we can roll with the punches as things change. What would you add to that, John?
Well, I would add a couple of things. I think, especially for the small/startup entity, I think it's conventional wisdom is figure out the fastest path to market. I think that, sometimes speed or, crystal clarity, if you will, from a regulatory standpoint is viewed as an asset, so to speak. And I think a lot of times that the objective that a startup takes on or proposes to tackle from a regulatory pathway standpoint is find the path of least resistance and the quickest path to get through those regulatory challenges. And I think that's I know you and I have talked a lot about this. That's not always going to be the case. I mean, just because 510K is the most common pathway for med device in U.S. doesn't necessarily mean that's the best option. So I think I like this angle because it gives the company puts them in a more strategic position to figure out what makes sense for their product and their technology.
Well, I couldn't agree more, John, and I would take it one step further. Perhaps I shouldn't say this in a podcast that's being recorded and is going to be listened to an awful lot of people. I don't know about you. I'm getting sick and tired of people when they talk to me, especially for the first time. They say they want the quickest, easiest, cheapest way to get their device onto the market. I mean, have you ever heard anybody come to you and say, I want to find the longest, most expensive way? It's so many times I see people being penny wise and pound foolish. They in their haste to do things quickly, they take shortcuts. In some cases, they don't necessarily do things right, or they don't do things that they really should, and they end up costing themselves a lot of problems later on. So believe me, I understand the importance in any company, including a startup, but in large companies as well, the importance of getting a product onto the market quickly. But on the other hand, we do, I think, have to we do have to consider all of our options, and sometimes the quickest pathway to market is not always the best.
Yeah, I'm reminded, I think there's some sort of old adage out there that what's good for the short term may not be good for the long term, and vice versa, I suppose. So I think you have to take more of a holistic approach.
I was just going to add, when it comes to strategy, I think it's good to have both a short-term as well as a long-term strategy. And as long as you understand the big picture, I have no problem with companies taking certain shortcuts, if you will, in the short term, as long as they have a long-term game plan. In other words, I'll give you a quick example. Another thing that differentiates my approach to this game is oftentimes when I start working with a company, they'll tell me what they want to put in terms of bells and whistles and features in their current generation, in their first generation of the device. And one of the things I usually ask for very early in the game is what I call a future features list. In other words, tell me about all the bells and whistles that you would like to add to your particular device in the future. And the reason why I like to have that from the beginning, or as close to the beginning of this process as possible, John, is because then I can, with the company, go down that future feature list. And I can say, you know what, this particular feature, this is going to be a pretty heavy lift. It's going to require more testing and so on. So it makes sense to, put that in Gen 2 or Gen 3 of the device. On the other hand, this other feature is a pretty easy thing to incorporate. So why don't we roll that into, our Gen 1 device right now? Bottom line, John, as I tell all my customers, the better I can understand their goals, not just in the short term, but in the longer term as well, the better I can help craft the appropriate strategy, both long-term as well as short-term strategy, and make sure that we ultimately get the ball over the goal line.
Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts. As you explain that, I'm reminded of some conversations I've had with another associate, a gentleman by the name of Devin Campbell with a company called Product, and I often hear him say, start with the end in mind and thinking about, the ultimate end in mind, and then work backwards and build your strategy and your plan with that end in mind. Of course, things pivot and change along the way, but I think that's what you just elaborated on is really key to that. The other thing that I'm thinking of is this is a journey, and understanding that there might be numerous pit stops along the way, if you will, to carry my travel metaphor through on this example. It's a journey. So, stop 1 might be a wellness exemption. Stop 2 might be class 1. Stop 3 might be 510K or de novo, or whatever the case may be. And this is where the strategy executive summary is good about defining or identifying those potential pit stops along the way. And then the third thing I'll share, going back to your poker analogy, I want to be at the final table at the end. And, I want to be the last person there in that poker game. And so, I may have to fold on a couple of those early hands, or maybe I'll be a little bit aggressive in those early hands. But nonetheless, I want to be there at that final table.
I think that's a wonderful extension of my poker metaphor, John. Thank you for doing that. And, I don't know Devin, but I think the end in mind philosophy that he shared with you, he actually took from Stephen Covey, who wrote 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, among other things. And one of Dr. Covey's 7 habits is begin with the end in mind. So, as they say, if you're going to steal from the best. Covey is one of the best, so you might as well steal from him.
Yeah, for sure. So you talked about the benefit of an executive regulatory strategy, executive summary for startup and smaller companies as part of the quote pitch deck, if you will. Seems like that same sort of methodology could be applicable even to larger, more established companies. Now, there may not be a formal pitch or investor per se, but at the same time, before I'm starting a project, I probably this would be a good thing for me to have mapped out before we invest, before my company invests time, effort, resources, et cetera, into this endeavor. Any other thoughts about how this executive summary could be utilized for larger, more established companies?
I'd like to take a moment to extend a personal invitation for everyone listening to attend the Greenlight Guru True Quality Virtual Summit. This 3-day, 3-track online event is completely free and will take place on June 2nd, 3rd, and 4th. And believe me, folks, this is a must-attend experience for all medical device quality, regulatory, and product development professionals. Reserve your spot now by visiting virtual-summit.greenlight.guru. We'll also include this link in the episode description. during the Greenlight Guru True Quality Virtual Summit will stream directly to your desktop from the comfort of your own home, with over 30 of the industry's top experts presenting a unique, personalized experience for attendees to learn actionable tips, trends, and best practices for streamlining development of innovative devices, staying ahead of regulatory changes, and achieving true quality for your medical devices and businesses. So before we resume this episode, head on over to virtual-summit.greenlight.guru to reserve your free all-access pass now.
Well, I think as I said before, for medium and large companies, it's very, very similar to a small company or a startup talking to a VC or an angel group, or even putting in an SBI or a grant application or something like that. You're not going to an outside organization, but in most larger companies, John, and I had to do this myself as an R&D engineer, working in larger companies many, many years ago, before you could devote any time or resources to developing a new device. Let's say as an R&D engineer, I come up with a new idea for a device or a modification of a device. I have to sell it to my senior management team, basically convince them that, hey, this is worth pursuing, and, go ahead and, authorize me to spend the time and the resources to get there. So I think that there's a heck of a lot of similarities between dealing with a VC, for example, and dealing with the senior management in your own company.
Yeah, for sure. So, I think in a startup case, I have some idea about the when I should be doing this, but it might be good to speak a little bit about when in my company or my project, et cetera, should I be creating a regulatory strategy executive summary?
Yeah, another great question, John. And one of my frustrations after playing this game for so many decades now is that in so many companies, certainly not all, but in so many companies, they don't bring regulatory in until very late in the product development process. In some cases, even at or beyond the point of design freeze. And I don't want to go so far as to say that's a mistake. However, I can say this: the earlier the company brings in regulatory, whether it's me or somebody else, the better. 1 nanosecond after coming up with the idea for the new device is not too soon. Because simply put, as a biomedical engineer and a regulatory professional, I can use my knowledge of both engineering and regulation to give the company options. For example, if the R&D engineer comes to me and says, well, I can design this device in one of 3 different ways. At the end of the day, they're all going to do the same thing. Then I would be able to look at that product, and I would say, well, okay, if you design it according to option number 2, that's going to greatly mitigate our regulatory burden in taking it through the FDA later. As opposed to if they've already gotten to the point of design freeze, if they're in the process of doing much of their V&V testing, then making those kinds of changes at that point are very difficult, very time-consuming, very expensive. And the metaphor that I sometimes use, John, is when my wife and I lived in Boston and we were refinishing the basement of our home. And the contractor put out on the ground in chalk lines where the walls were going to be. And the contractor said, make darn sure that these chalk lines are where you want them, because if you want to move a wall 6 inches one way or the other or something, it's very easy to do. You just rub out the chalk line and you make a new one. After I build the walls, I can still move them, but it becomes a heck of a lot more time consuming and expensive to do. So bottom line, the earlier that a company brings in regulatory into the product development process, I think the better. And in terms of the regulatory strategy executive summary, don't worry about getting everything complete or perfect on the first draft. It's not going to happen. Just get a first draft and then come back to it from time to time and iterate it. Just like for those in our audience who do or have done in the past medical device design, we don't necessarily try to design the perfect device in generation 1. We design the device as best as we can for Gen 1, and then we start to use it, we start to test it, and then we might start to tweak it to make improvements and so on. It's a very iterative process, whether you're talking about designing a device or designing a regulatory strategy executive summary. It's a very iterative kind of a process.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the iteration is key with, frankly, just about everything that we do. This is one of the things that it's kind of a pet peeve. I think a lot of times people think about, plans and strategy documents. It's almost like if they document it and they archive it. And it's like, no, 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 no. These things are dynamic. They change, they evolve, and they iterate. And so I think that's really important to factor in to this regulatory strategy. So we've talked about a little bit about when and how and those sorts of things. Let's talk a little bit about the what is it? What goes into a regulatory executive summary?
So great question, John. We can make this as short or as long as we want. From my past experience, typical regulatory strategy executive summaries are roughly about 2 to maybe 3 pages long. Sometimes I'll get a summary from somebody who, it might be 30 pages or longer. Not to be, argue semantics, but it kind of depends on your definition of summary. To me, 30 pages is not a summary, but that's just me.
Yeah.
And by the way, this is something that we come up with ourselves. Somebody asked me, for example, can we get a example or a template of a regulatory strategy executive summary from the FDA? And I said, absolutely not. And they said, why? And I said, because quite frankly, that's not their job. It's your job to put this together. So some of the components that go into most of my regulatory strategy executive summaries, and again, I don't take a one-size-fits-all approach. Every device is different. Every technology is different. Every company is different. But some of the common elements, if you will, would include things like the device description. Doesn't necessarily have to be a full-blown device description, but at least a basic explanation of the device, what it does, how it works. And the most important part of the device description in the context of a regulatory strategy executive summary is what are the technological bells and whistles or features that will influence the regulatory strategy. So, for example, if you have a certain set of technological features, that might make it easier to sell as a 510K. And on the other hand, if you have another set of technological features, that might make it easier to sell as a de novo. That kind of information in the device description would never go into a pre-sub device description. It would certainly never go into a submission to the FDA as a device description. So even though I use the phrase device description in the regulatory strategy executive summary, the connotation of device description is a little bit different than the typical connotation of device description. In other words, sometimes people say to me, well, we've already got one device description, therefore we can just copy and paste it into all the different documents that we needed. And that's not necessarily the case. So before continuing to the other elements, John, does that make sense? Is there anything that you would add in terms of the device description?
No, it makes sense.
Okay, great. So another element that usually goes into my summaries would be the labeling matrix. In a nutshell, this would be a list of all of our different possible label claims, ranging from the easiest to the most difficult. And by the way, John, just to add, one of the many things that differentiates my approach to so many others is, as I said earlier, I will never be the regulatory police. I will never tell the company what they cannot say or what claims they cannot make. On the contrary, I say to the company, you can make any claim that you want. For example, and I'm going to use an extreme example, you can claim that your new device cures cancer and regrows missing limbs if you want to, as long as you can prove it, as long as you can support it. So a list of all of those labeling claims, potential labeling claims, put together is what I call a labeling matrix. And that's another key element of the regulatory strategy executive summary, because just like the device description, those different claims are going to greatly impact your regulatory strategy and your pathway to market. Class 1 exempt, 510K, de novo, PMA, wellness, what have you. And a related component is another section of the summary is classification of risk. Classification and risk. Some discussion of the classification of the product as well as the risks of the product is warranted. Doesn't have to be, a 300-page PhD dissertation. Like I said, I try to keep this whole document to just a few pages, but acknowledging, having some discussion of classification and risk for anybody else that's reading the document, whether it's an investor or somebody else, they will know that we know what the heck that we're doing, that we haven't forgotten anything. So the first three categories that I mentioned: device description, labeling matrix, classification, and risk. Any comments, anything that you would add on any of those, John, before continuing on?
Well, maybe a little bit. So, when you talk about all of those elements, and then I'll pick on risk a little bit. This is not necessarily risk for the tactical pathway per se. This is just in general, right? This is the overview risk of this particular product.
Well, that's a great question, John. And you're right. I want to not oversimplify because, as you and many of your audience know, I happen to be a subject matter expert for FDA in a few different areas, one of them being risk. So in this context of the regulatory strategy executive summary, what I'm primarily thinking of here is regulatory risk. In other words, if we decide to go one particular pathway, what is the relative probability of being successful or not taking it through the FDA as opposed to another pathway? Every single regulatory pathway to market has a certain degree of regulatory risk. You cannot eliminate it. You can certainly try to minimize it, but you cannot eliminate it. And so one of the things that I provide with the companies that I work with is an assessment as best as I can as to what their regulatory risk would be under each of these different pathways that they're choosing. Sometimes, usually, it's very difficult to quantify. I can't say that, well, if you take this path, you have an 87% chance of being successful, as opposed to if you take another path, you have a 32% chance of being successful. I usually can't quantify it in those terms, but what I can do is give them a relative comparison. In other words, this one has a relatively high regulatory risk as opposed to this one that is, moderate or low or something like that.
Yeah. All right, that helps. Thank you for elaborating on that a little bit. All right, so what else goes into the regulatory strategy executive summary?
So some of the other sections, and again, there's going to be variability. Some summaries will have all of these sections, some will not. But obviously, the potential pathways to market, the list of the different, maybe it's a wellness device, maybe it's class 1 exempt, maybe it's class 2 510K, maybe it's class 2 de novo, maybe it's class 3 PMA, maybe it's class 3 HTE, and so on and so on. So a list of all of the possibilities, or at the very least, the most plausible possibilities. Let me just remind our audience, John, that there are some devices where exactly the same device can be brought onto the market in very different pathways. For example, one device, if I label it one way, I can bring it onto the market under the wellness exemption. The exact same device, if I label it another way, it might be class 1 exempt. If the exact same device, if I labeled it a third way, it might be class 2 510K. The exact same device, if I label it a fourth way, might be class 2 de novo. And in some, albeit extreme examples, John, yet the exact same device, if I label it a fifth way, might be a PMA or an HTE, class 3. So a discussion of the possible pathways to market is certainly an important part of that regulatory strategy executive summary. And then we have a few other parts that I usually include as well. I personally think that our communication strategy with the FDA is very important. As you and I have talked about many times in the past, John, I happen to be a big fan of the pre-sub process. In spite of the frustrations of dealing it with the FDA, I still think overall the benefits outweigh the risks. And so some discussion of our communication strategy with the FDA is warranted. In other words, do we plan to do a pre-sub? And if so, when? And an estimation of time and cost and so on. And an overall estimation of timeline and cost for the entire strategy is useful. So in other words, if we take option 1, say 510K, approximately this is how long it's going to take and this is how much it's going to cost to get it onto the market. Whereas if we do option 2, de novo, it will be different numbers and so on. Then there's a couple of other sort of miscellaneous categories. Well, sorry, I don't want to call it miscellaneous, but other sections that may or may not go into the document. So I'll just mention them very briefly. Some mention on our international regulatory strategy. In many cases, is important because obviously we live in a global economy, and most of the time companies are not looking at bringing a device onto the market just in one place. Like in the U.S., they probably want to bring it onto the market in the EU and in Japan and in Canada and other places. So some mention of international regulatory strategy is important. Some mention of reimbursement strategy is also important, because even though reimbursement is a separate and distinct animal, there's a lot of overlap between regulatory and reimbursement. As I think you and I have talked a little bit about in the past, John, I now more and more have to design my regulatory strategy to be in sync with my reimbursement strategy. And in some cases, I've had to change my regulatory strategy to match my reimbursement strategy. And one thing to keep in mind is that, oftentimes I hear people complain about the amount of data that FDA will want to see for a clearance or an approval. But that amount of data that FDA usually wants to see usually pales in comparison to the amount of data that CMS wants to see for reimbursement.
Yeah.
So some discussion of that in the regulatory strategy executive summary, I also think is important.
I think that's a really important point, because I see this all too often, is that, we think, or the company may think about that regulatory path and, go full steam ahead toward a particular regulatory path. And then they get towards the end of that initial journey anyway. And, maybe at a point where they've already submitted something to the FDA and they haven't even begun to think about reimbursement strategy. And so I think that point is really key, that the time to think about it is at the front end. Because, to be quite blunt, if there's somebody if there's no one paying for it, then you're probably going to have a struggle in your go-to-market.
I completely agree, John. It's obviously very important for the company to be considering those things early on. But I would also remind our audience, keep in mind the audience that we're writing this document for. If we're writing this document in part for investors, we want to demonstrate to our potential investors that we know what the heck we're doing and that we haven't forgotten anything. So, for example, if we don't mention anything about international regulatory strategy, if we don't mention anything about reimbursement, if we don't mention anything about communication with the FDA in the form of a precept or something else, how do we know? How does the person who's reading this document or listening to the presentation know if you are aware of this and just didn't include it, or frankly, you don't know what the heck you're doing because you didn't even know to think about that? So this is the strategy that I use with FDA all the time. I want to demonstrate to my FDA friends or to my investor friends, or quite frankly, whoever the heck it is, that yes, I know what the heck I'm doing. Yeah, you can certainly give me, your suggestions and I'll take them under advisement. But at the end of the day, this is my parade. This is my ballgame.
Yeah, I think this has been amazing. So I appreciate you going into some depth and detail on this. One final question, and of course, your final thoughts to kind of wrap things up today. As you talked about a regulatory strategy and the executive summary, would this be a beneficial item to review with FDA during a pre-submission process?
Interesting question, John. Let me come back to that in just a moment. The last thing that I just want to mention to just kind of close the loop on what goes into the regulatory strategy executive summary. I always end with, a section called summary and recommendations, which is just sort of a synopsis of what I've said in the rest of the document and my takeaway points. And then, anything after that in terms of, additional resources or references you can add as an appendix. But the reason why I mention, summary and recommendations, to me, John, it's a statement of the obvious. Just like at the beginning, you have an overview and introduction. Just coincidentally, I got from one of my customers yesterday a draft document that they were going to send to the FDA. There was no overview and introduction. There was no summary and conclusion. It's like, put yourself in the shoes of the person that's reading this. The first thing that they have to understand, and they used to teach this in high school, John, or maybe even elementary school. Maybe they don't teach it anymore. You have to tell the person, what is the purpose of this document?
So what? Yeah. Yeah.
Okay,
that last statement reminds me of an English teacher I had in high school. She said, you can make any argument or statement or position that you want, just support it and explain why. So I think really good tip there.
Coming back to your question about would you share this regulatory strategy executive summary with the FDA? My answer is 99.9% of the time, absolutely not. And here's why. because this is supposed to be an internal document. It's supposed to be a document shared with maybe potential investors or something like that. It represents our thoughts, our ideas, a lot of different possibilities. The last thing that you would want to do, John, in my opinion, is to go to the FDA and say, gee, there's 3 different ways that we can bring our device onto the market. What would you suggest would be the method that we would use? That is just so contrary to my tail don't ask, lead don't follow.
Yeah, that's a good point.
But here's what I would do, though, is you create this regulatory strategy executive summary with all of your different options. You use this as a set of talking points for discussion, both within your organization as well as, your senior management, your investors, whoever it is. Once you settle on a regulatory pathway to market, then you go to the FDA and you take it to them. So there is a relationship. You can use the regulatory strategy executive summary as a stepping stone, for example, to your pre-sub package, but it's not. The regulatory strategy executive summary should not be, in my opinion, your pre-sub package.
All right, that's a fair point, and I appreciate that. And Mike, I definitely appreciate going into depth and detail on this. So, folks, I want to remind you that you probably know this by now if you've listened to any episodes of the Global Medical Device Podcast that I do with Mike Drues with Vascular Sciences. He is an expert, and he knows how to play this poker game, if you will. So I highly encourage you reaching out to him if you have questions or comments or you need additional tips or pointers. He's a resource that can help you build very solid regulatory strategy and someone that you want in your corner because of how long and how effective he is at playing this game, if you will. So, Mike, thank you so much for being a guest once again. Look forward to the next time that you and I get to speak.